Hey everybody, Bryn here, welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. We are starting a new tournament, which is exciting, and I have a tough opponent right out of the bat. I'm playing against Alexander Reprincev, who I've actually played before. I ended up drawing that game. I should have won it. I offered a draw in a position that was... I would have pushed it against anyone else. Given the same circumstances. But I was just really unconfident there, and that's not a good thing. I think you need a little bit more delusion to convert those things, but maybe it's my old age. Anyways, so here we can see that I'm playing with the white pieces, and let's get into it. Oh, let me just move my mic a little bit first. Excellent. Okay, so e4. C5, and this is already departure of what they've played before and what I would expect from this player. So originally, I, in the first game, prepared the Scandinavian that they've played actually quite a bit. I actually checked out a bunch of lines and even asked them after the game, the first time, hey, do you play this move and then a specific sub-variation that I won't get into now? And they said, yeah. And I said, you know that loses by force, right? And they're like, yeah, that's why I stopped playing it, which is really funny because can you imagine, this was their first time switching out from the Scandinavian in like a decade. And they played this line that if you prepared it and if you like know it enough, you could win by force. And I had it prepared and ready, and they played E5. And this time they played C5. So they're, I guess, testing out new openings. And that is both a good thing for me and a bad thing for me. Bad thing because obviously if I could win by force, I'd like to. But the good thing is that I'm hoping that the knowledge is like closer to even. If this is, E4 is the thing that I've been playing for forever and they don't really play too many C5 or E5 positions, I'm hoping that that helps me. But after knight F3, knight C6, and bishop to B5, we get into a raw Salimo, which is probably one of the things I know the least. And not only that, but they play this move Queen B6. And I vividly remember during the game that the move Bishop takes C6 is very strong. Now it does have one drawback to it, but we'll get into that in a moment. I played knight to C3. So this is fine. But bishop takes c6 is a very, very sharp but very good move. First off, I didn't have time to prepare against this variation, or maybe I guess I did because I've seen it before, but not by this player or not in these settings. And it was a first round event, so you don't really expect anything, honestly. Like you can't really expect to know what you're playing as, whether it's white or black or whatever, because the pairings are made like 15 minutes before the round. So knight c3 is fine, and it's a very principled move. But bishop takes c6 is a very dynamic option, and it's hard for me to do this for two reasons. One, I'm very hesitant to give up the bishop for the knight, and two, it actually is a pawn sacrifice. So after queen takes on c6, you might be thinking, oh, let's play knight c3 and castle. But actually, it turns out castling is just the best option by a long shot. The whole point here is after queen takes on e4, we can now play knight c3 or d4 first. That's actually very good as well. But you can kind of choose your move order here, knight c3 and d4. Or again, d4, and then after takes, and then something like knight to c3. And the whole point here is that although you end up giving up a full pawn after something like pawn takes and knight takes, black's going to find it incredibly difficult to develop, right? They need to make some sort of dark squared weakness at some point, or they have to waste even more time with something like d6 and then e6. And at that point, again, they're kind of in a tricky spot. Turns out, I believe it's like +1. I do believe white has an advantage here. Last time I checked, it was a while since I checked the official evaluation of this position, but it's good. And even though it's good, I still wasn't really confident about playing it. Again, knowing that something is good uh, from like a objective standpoint is different from knowing if you could play it. But I think this was more of a weakness on my part than on, oh, this is a preference line. This is probably objectively one of the best things to play here, and it's also something that you might not want to play because you're giving up a pawn. So a lot to think about. So after queen b6, I played again knight c3, and then we see e6, and so I decided to just play it like a normal, almost like a closed Sicilian actually. Castles, very natural move, and then knight to d4. So of course, knight takes d4 is a really bad move here. After pawn takes, unfortunately, we're losing a piece. The knight has to move, which gives up the bishop, or if we move the bishop, the knight can be captured by the pawn. So bishop to c4 is by far the best move. Bishop to d3 and e2 make almost no sense at all, because one of the big things they want to do is actually take this bishop. That's why, for example, a4 has a little bit more credibility to it than bishop to e2, but even a move like a4 is a little undesirable because you're giving up that bishop. The reason why a4, by the way, could be a bit decent is because if they end up taking, we can take with the pawn and maybe make it more difficult to break out or play any active queenside moves like a6 and b5, or even if they move, maybe if they try playing b6, we could play it first. It's not really a surprising idea. So bishop c4, trying to keep that bishop. Queen to c7, and I made a pretty stupid move here. I played rook to e1. The rook wants to be on the f-file here. There is no doubt about it. These are kind of like closed Sicilian positions, and what you'll often see is something like d3. At this point, knight takes d4 is pretty much ready. Almost like you need to play d3 first, as we'll see in a moment. And then you'll maybe see something like queen to e1, f4, queen g3, and just start attacking the king side. These Grand Prix positions have this in common. So, for example, yeah, d3, bishop to e7 is actually really, really bad. They need to take on f3, surprisingly. Because if they don't, then after bishop to e7, like I showed, knight takes d4, c takes, and now you actually have a more aggressive option, which is knight to b5. And there's a couple ways that black can deal with this. I think the two most likely or two most interesting are queen b6 and queen c5. You could also go queen b8 to try to avoid any bishop to f4. This does, I think, make some sense. I would be curious if a move like g3 does cause problems, though. Maybe not, because I think they might just be fine. If bishop f4, there's e5. But there's a lot of things to consider, and it does give up the pawn. So maybe it's not even good, now that I think about it. So, yeah, queen b6, for example, holding on to the pawn, I think is probably the lesser of the two. And the reason why is because you can go a4, and you're ready for moves like a5 as well. So even if a6 comes, you can go a5. And this is incredibly strong. And if queen c5, I mean, I'm just calculating off the cuff here, but b4 looks quite nice with bishop to a3 on the way. And I'm having a bit of a difficult time seeing something too wrong with this. Again, we're trying to be a bit aggressive. So b4, queen takes b4, bishop to a3. Oh, no, just knight c7 check. That's even easier. So that is just excellent. And if they go queen c6, all of a sudden we can take on d4 with tempo, and now we can play something like c3 to actually defend this b4 pawn. A lot of stuff going on, but it's pretty important nonetheless. I guess I could just add an extra note because I'm just interested. They can't really play that. I'm just wondering, yeah, I don't see a good way for them to even attack this knight, where if I play c3, they can take on b4, because queen d6 blocks the diagonal. But even if they could, the reason why I mentioned that is because if they did that, trying to undermine, knight e6 might work because the bishop's covering. So many, it's like a bunch of conceptual calculation at this point. It's not important. The better move likely here is queen to c5, but again, after c3, instead of trying to win a pawn or just go crazy, we're just having an excellent position. We're ready to take on d4, even if they recapture. We could look at both pawn takes and knight takes, and it helps get rid of a bit of a wedge in the center that we're dealing with. For example, takes, now we're ready for moves like bishop to e3, and again, knight takes c3, or maybe even pawn takes c3, depending on how we want to play it, or depending on what black plays. And just an excellent position again. So I say that because it's pretty important to understand that this is kind of like what we're trying to do in the Grand Prix. But it's not. It's a Rossalimo. But some Rossalimos can look like close Sicilians because it kind of is one. So Rook E1, for so many reasons, is wrong. And that's my interpretation of a lot of them. So after Rook to E1, A6 was played. And here I should go bishop to F1. I was really unhappy about this. I thought about it during the game, right? That's why Rook E1 usually gets played, and that's why you need to play bishop to F1. But you just played bishop to B5, and then to C4, and then to F1. If it was bishop to B5, and then I just go straight to F1, I would just play it in a heartbeat. I wouldn't think about it. But because I was already on this diagonal, I thought, should I try to stay on it with A4? And that's what I did, because again, sometimes you see moves like b5 later, and it feels like that's actually what you want to do. Here, it's just incorrect, though. So b6 was played, d3, finally, knight to e7, and this finally allows me to take on d4. Arguably, they should have moved their knight away or actually taken on f3, but it's a hard thing to do. C takes on d4, knight to e2, knight to c6, and bishop to f4. c3 is arguably better. And again, the whole point is that this pawn is kind of like a wedge in our position. It's the big problem. It's nice that we were able to take on d4 because their knight was quite strong, and we have a slight space disadvantage. But after a move like c3, we do get rid of that space disadvantage as well, which is quite nice. So after d takes and b takes, if they play something like knight e5, we can go bishop to b3 with very simple moves like bishop to f4 and d4 on the horizon, and even f4, actually. Instead, yeah, bishop to f4 was played. They played bishop d6, and I was very happy to see this because they've played e6 in the center, and I'm expecting them to have some sort of problems on these dark squares. But does it come to fruition is the most important question. So f4, and amazingly, this wasn't played, but they have the move g5. And, I mean, you kind of maybe see things like this on your peripheral sometimes. But for me, this was like that. This is a kind of crazy move. Again, very conventional play. Seems like, oh yeah, let's just castle short. That's kind of a problem. It actually does make a little bit of sense for them to castle long and kind of go absolutely crazy, especially after a move like f4. Maybe I should have waited to play this move. But g5 takes, and then h6, amazingly. And I believe it's a close to equal position, but the attack that they're starting to form is pretty nuts. I give h6 an exclam because, I mean, g5, the typical move is like rook g8, and then if h4, then h6, something like that. But I just loved how it was just g5, then h6. Just get rid of the pawns, castle long, or even king e7, but probably castle long, and just go nuts. So, yeah, again, really cool. Bishop to b7. I played rook to f1. So again, this whole rook e1 to f1 thing is just biting me. Because if my rook was already on f1, then I could have played a move like e5. And I don't even think... Maybe it's not great, but it's not as bad. Maybe. Then they played h5. So here I played a move that I thought was going to be good. But it just wasn't at all. I played knight g3, and there's a very provocative reason why I did, and we'll get into that. But I should have played queen to d2. Where after h4 and h3, they castle long still, rook a b1. They go for f6 with the idea of g5, trying to really open up this side of the board. And I should just go for b4. To me, it's a lot easier to see how black's attack starts to formulate. For white, not as much. But this is probably the best chance that white has at anything in this position. So knight to g3. The provocative idea is maybe I'll take on h5. The other idea is that I thought this was a good double attack type of position where I'm going to go for e5. Right? So can you imagine h4, e5, queen c7, and then knight e4? Looks quite good. But there's a problem here too. So even when I thought that both moves were working, whether they played h4 or whether they sacrificed the pawn, it really didn't work out in my favor. So here my thought was after knight e4, again this knight is quite nice, but there's an immediate problem with knight takes e5, and it has to do with the fact that this pawn is actually overloaded. It can't defend both the knight and the bishop on c4. For example, after takes and then bishop takes, if I take on e4, they can now take on c4. So they just won a pawn out of it, and they still have a bit of an attack going. Actually, they could even maybe look at the c file, especially if it gets to an endgame like castling long, king b7, rook c8. If they ever trade off queens, endgames are good for them. It's pretty bad, and I'm just losing there. Instead, knight a5 was played. But this isn't really much better. I still have to play into knight takes h5, and I just couldn't. I'm not sure why I didn't, but this is still bad. I think that's the problem, because after bishop to b3 was played, h4, then that's what happened in the game. But after knight takes h5, knight take here, knight a take here, this bishop is incredibly strong. Maybe I take on g7, but even if I do, maybe they just go king e7. Doesn't even look unreasonable at all. And eventually a move like rook to g8 is going to come, and something's happening. They don't need that extra pawn or any pawns on this side of the board, because my king is incredibly weak compared to theirs. Now, so bishop to b3 was played in the game with knight a5, h4, and I go e5, where we see queen c5, and I ended up just going to e4 anyways, knowing that this was going to be quite a bad position, but it feels like it's almost necessary at this point. They took on e4, and then they played h3, which is just a normal move to try to break things up here. I played queen d3. So I was really worried of d3 check, just hanging over my head. I think this is the problem of a lower rated player. After all, my opponent is an international master. They kind of know what they're doing. Me, I don't. Let's be honest. Especially in these Sicilian positions that I find myself in, it feels like I'm just always 2 or 3 steps behind my opponent, even when I'm coming up with my plans and everything. But h3, I know that g3 is a move. By the way, it's a very obvious move. But my concern was not only d3 check, but also what happens after, I don't know, crazy moves like g5. But it's just the best way to play it. I was thinking after d3 check and rook f2, which is the best way to play, maybe I'm fine. But I also thought that after queen d3, they take on g2 and then rook to f2, I'm also potentially fine, because even though the h file opened up, I was hoping that they couldn't really actually attack it until g5. Now they're overloading another pawn. This f4 pawn is not able to continue to defend on e5. If I push, they just take on e5 with a massive attack, winning the game. And if I take, then they take with a massive attack and winning the game. So I played rook to d1, trying to hopefully trade queens in just a hopeless position. They take on f4, we trade, and then they go knight to c6, pretty much getting the pawn back. So I go rook d to d2. They go rook to h4, defending f4, which I thought was nice because it's just annoying. I took on g2. They go king e7, and then I go rook to g5 just to defend the pawn. They go rook h8, and then I go bishop to c4, just making a threat. And here they took on e5, and I have to respond because knight to f3 is a big problem, and I have to deal with it. So my way of dealing with it was rook takes e5, which doesn't really inspire too much confidence, let's say. And we'll see why this doesn't really work. But if I play something like bishop to e2, they have rook takes on h2. I mean, already we can see that even after the queen trade, white's going to be losing this game. It's equal material, but this is not an equal position whatsoever. My pawn structure is atrocious. Their knight is incredibly well placed. Their king is incredibly safe. And I can't really say the same for myself. So after taking on e5, rook to g4 check was played. And the whole point here is there's a piece of mine that is a bit stuck. So I go king f1, and then they go d6. And as you can see, turns out that actually my rook is trapped after this rook g4 check. If they end up going f6 here, I believe that this also works out for them. I mean, I'm having trouble calculating any problems here. But maybe they were concerned with something along the lines of rook takes d7 and then rook takes e6, where maybe I got a little bit more, and they're trying to minimize the damages or like any potential counterplay I have. Here, it still looks kind of hopeless, but I can actually understand why they would maybe try to avoid this, just because it's a couple extra pawns. So rook g4, king f1, and d6. Rook is trapped. There's nowhere to go, as we can see. Boom, boom, boom. Bishop to e2 is quite good, and I did consider it, but after f3, bishop takes f3, and rook to f4, it felt hopeless, so I tried to go for something a little different, because the whole point is rook g5 is now playable. You do get your rook out, but at the price of the bishop, and once the bishop falls, again, the structure is just so horrible here that, yeah, white's probably still losing anyways. I mean, looking at it now, it looks like there's some small chances of holding this, but that might be copium a bit. Might just be coping, just because this pawn is incredibly weak. This pawn feels incredibly weak. Black's king is still, again, very safe, but that's definitely possible. Instead, I go rook to f5, and the whole point here is I'm trying to just put everything on knight squares. So after they take, and I take, I can eventually go bishop to d3. They go f3 first. I didn't want to take for some reason. I went b3. I'm wondering if I didn't want to take because after this, and then something like bishop to d3, that there's rook a1 check. This is probably what I saw. And then rook takes h2, something like this. And this is just a pretty straightforward win at this point. After f2, I can't go king e2 because it blocks my bishop. So instead, b3 was played. Rook to g2. Which is just a nice way to simplify the position. They're up a pawn, or a point of material. They're down a pawn, but they're up in exchange. Exchange is 2 points, though. So their chances of winning here are incredibly high, and it is just a winning position. But I tried my best. So king f6. Again, I can take on a6. My worry here was that this pawn is more valuable than the a pawn, though, because it at least blockades this f7 pawn. So I go bishop to d3. They go king e5. I go king g3. And then they push a5. So I start pushing h4. Was this the best option? Probably not. I'm just wondering what would like maybe that something like shuffling my king between g2 and g3 or something like this might actually be just a better option. But I go h4 and king g4, and they have a very simple plan now. At some point, they will likely be ready with an exchange sacrifice. This is one of the best reasons, or one of the reasons why having more material than less is a good thing, because even when one side is trying to put up a fortress or just defend in an annoying way, usually you can give back that material and get something even greater out of it. Like, for example, a rook versus bishop ending is much harder to win than a king and pawn ending where you're just immediately promoting. And that is actually quite possible here. So I go h5, and I can't really push any further than this. So I go bishop to b5 with the idea of shuffling either my bishop or my king. They go king to e3. I go bishop to c6. They go king to e4. And then I bring my bishop over to g6 for some reason. I still think that I should force them into playing this position out with a bishop to d3, where eventually they do have to make that sacrifice and maybe my pawn would run. But first off, I guess actually king e4, there is rook g8 check as a threat. That's important to mention. So I didn't actually have that opportunity there. Rook to h7, bishop to e8, and then d4. Now, again, I would like to bring the bishop back, but again, rook g7 check is a problem. So I believe that's what I was worried about here. Bishop c6 check is possible. But again, after king e5, this rook g7 is just a massive problem. But I could always go back to e8. Interesting. Either way, I went bishop g6 first. They went rook c7, and I started pushing. But now after rook to c8, even if I could get up here in time, it's just not fast enough. Bishop to h5. They take on f5. King g7. They go king to e4. And after taking on f6 and king d3, I ended up resigning. I ended up playing it on up till this point because there was always some little tricks that I had in mind, but they just converted so smoothly that there wasn't really anything more to do. At this point, it's very obvious that I'm not going to be holding this game. Because anytime I go king to g7 with the idea of bishop to f7, they're already ready to promote by the time I actually play bishop f7. The only idea, again, that I have here is either going king g7 and then promoting, or I have the idea of king g7, bishop f7, bishop g8. I can't take my bishop away from the promotion square. It's just not able to be timed correctly. And when I go king g7 and king c2, and then promote, takes. Unfortunately, black is just able to promote themselves, and they are just a little bit closer to this side of the board, and will easily just mop up all the pawns and win the game. So yeah, that's why I ended up resigning after king to d3. Just waiting an extra move to see, hey, maybe they allow something like bishop f7 and bishop g8. You never know, something like this. But yeah, it was also momentum. Not too important, but I feel like there was a couple good things to learn. Again, it's important to recommend, or not recommend, but remind myself and just ourselves as a collective that when you're playing an opening, sometimes it can transpose, and it's important not only to look at where the pieces are, but also what pawn structures you have. And at this point, when you're not taking on c6 or they're playing some sort of weird position, you have to ask yourself, okay, this doesn't really feel like it's within the opening that I normally play. Does it have the same pawn structure? If so, then maybe the same plans still work, or something along those lines. But if it's not the typical structures you're used to, then maybe you should consider asking yourself, well, what structures is it close to? Or are there any plans you think that are unique to something that you have? And again, rook e1 was a bit of a problem for me here. Assuming we're not just talking about the opening, which I shouldn't have played the way I did. But yeah, that's a rookie one, and obviously the early castles giving up the e4 pawn is the two big things that I have to think about here. So, yep. That's gonna be it for this game. Kind of trailed off at the end. I'm tired. I'm a little tired. I'm gonna go to sleep after this. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time with another tournament game analysis video. The next round, unfortunately, my opponent did not show up. So I waited all morning there. I waited like 6 hours at the tournament hall for the following game. And it also invalidated any chances to get a norm. So that's quite upsetting. I'm still of the opinion that if you don't show up to a game, the game should count as a rated loss. But it doesn't, which is a bit silly to me. All right. That's going to be it. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.